The grocery store was buzzing with activity that evening. Shoppers weaved through the aisles, baskets full, pushing carts, some in a rush, others taking their time. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery lingered in the air, mixing with the sound of beeping registers and murmured conversations. General Marcus Reed had just finished a long day at the base. He was tired, but he didn't mind stopping by the store to grab a few things before heading home. Dressed in his neatly pressed army fatigues, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades serving his country. As he walked down the aisle, browsing the shelves, he didn't notice the officer at first. Sergeant Bill Henderson had been standing near the entrance, scanning the crowd like he was looking for trouble. He was a veteran of the force, but his instincts weren't always based on logic. Some habits ran deeper than training, and when his eyes landed on Marcus, something in him just assumed the worst. It wasn't the uniform that caught his attention, it was the man wearing it. The way Marcus walked, the ease with which he carried himself, the quiet authority in his posture, it made Henderson uneasy. In his mind, men like that weren't supposed to act like they owned the place. Without stopping to think, he adjusted his belt, squared his shoulders, and made his way toward Marcus. Marcus finally noticed him as he reached for a box of cereal. He saw the way the officer's gaze locked onto him, the way his jaw tightened as if preparing for a confrontation. He'd been in enough situations like this to know exactly what was happening. The uniform didn't matter. The years of service didn't matter. The medals, the deployments, the sacrifices, none of it meant anything in this moment. To this officer, he was just a man who didn't belong. "Hey, you." Henderson's voice was sharp, loud enough to cut through the hum of the store. A few people glanced up from their shopping, sensing the sudden shift in energy. Marcus turned slowly, keeping his expression neutral. "Yes, officer." "Let me see some ID." There it was. No explanation, no reason, just a demand. Marcus had seen this before. He knew how these things played out. He took a slow breath, keeping his composure. "Is there a problem?" "I asked for ID," Henderson repeated, stepping closer. His hand rested on his holster, a silent threat lingering between them. Marcus didn't flinch. He had faced war zones, led men into battle, made life-and-death decisions in the heat of combat. A grocery store standoff with a cop who had something to prove wasn't going to shake him. "And I asked if there was a problem," he replied evenly. Henderson's grip on his belt tightened. His patience was wearing thin. When a police officer asks for ID, you show it. Now. By now, a small crowd had started to form at a distance, watching the scene unfold. People weren't sure what was happening, but they could feel the tension in the air. Some whispered to each other, while others pulled out their phones, just in case. Marcus exhaled slowly. He had two choices: comply or stand his ground. And in that moment, he decided he was done complying with men like this. Men who saw the uniform but not the man, men who made assumptions before asking questions. "I don't believe I need to show you anything," Marcus said calmly. "I'm here to buy groceries, just like everyone else." That was it. That was all it took. Henderson saw defiance where there was none, saw a challenge where there was only dignity. And in that split second, he made a choice. His hand moved to his gun. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The room seemed to freeze. The onlookers couldn't believe what they were seeing. A police officer, drawing his weapon inside a grocery store, on a man who had done nothing wrong. Marcus didn't move. His heart was steady, his mind sharp. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was home. And yet, here he was, staring down the barrel of a gun in the middle of a grocery store. For a brief second, time stood still. Shoppers clutched their carts, parents pulled their children closer, and the hum of the store was replaced by a suffocating silence. Then, just as quickly as it had happened, something shifted. Henderson's radio crackled to life. A voice on the other end, sharp and urgent. "Sergeant, stand down immediately. Do you know who that is?" The words hit him like a brick. Confusion flickered across his face, but his hand remained on the weapon. His instincts screamed at him to stay in control. But then another voice cut through the silence, this one coming from behind him. A commanding, authoritative voice that made his stomach drop. "Sergeant, I suggest you holster that weapon. Now." Henderson turned slightly, still gripping his gun, only to see two high-ranking officers from his own department approaching. Their faces were tight with barely restrained anger. And in that moment, it all started to sink in. The weight of what he had done, the mistake he had made. Because Marcus Reed wasn't just any man in uniform. He wasn't some random soldier. He was General Marcus Reed, a decorated Army general, a man who had spent his entire life serving and protecting the very country Henderson claimed to stand for. And now, in front of an entire store full of witnesses, Henderson had just pulled a gun on him. The regret hit instantly, the realization that he had just made the worst mistake of his career. But it was too late. The damage was already done. And what happened next, no one saw coming. The store was completely silent, the tension thick enough to cut through. Shoppers stood frozen, eyes darting between the police sergeant gripping his gun and the two senior officers approaching with measured steps. General Marcus Reed remained still, his hands by his sides, his face unreadable. He wasn't afraid, he'd have faced worse. But there was something heavy in the air, something that made even him feel the weight of the moment. Sergeant Henderson's breath was uneven, his grip still firm around his gun. His mind was racing. He had acted on impulse, fueled by an assumption that now felt dangerously wrong. The voices crackling through his radio, the urgency in the tone of his approaching superiors, none of it made sense to him yet. But one thing was clear: he had crossed a line. One of the senior officers, a captain named Rivera, stopped just a few feet away. His face was tight with frustration, but his voice remained controlled. "Sergeant, I'm only going to say this once. Put your weapon away." Henderson hesitated, his ego battling with the reality of the situation. He glanced around, realizing the entire store was watching. People had their phones out, recording, documenting. His hands twitched slightly. Then slowly he lowered his weapon, slipping it back into its holster. Marcus let out a slow breath. His eyes never left Henderson's face, studying him carefully, as if he could see every thought running through the officer's mind. Henderson looked away, suddenly unable to meet Marcus's gaze. "Step back," Rivera ordered. "Now." Henderson clenched his jaw but obeyed, taking 2 steps backward, his hands now resting stiffly at his sides. The other officer, a lieutenant named Parker, turned toward Marcus, his voice softer but still firm. "General Reed, are you all right, sir?" The words hung in the air. Henderson's eyes widened slightly. General Reed. His stomach twisted. "I'm fine," Marcus said evenly, his voice controlled but laced with something deeper. "Though I can't say I'm surprised." Henderson's pulse pounded. He felt the weight of every single eye in the room pressing down on him. He had made an assumption. He had let his biases take over. And now, the consequences were unfolding right in front of him. Rivera exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose before turning to Henderson. "Sergeant, do you even know who you just pulled a gun on?" Henderson swallowed hard. He felt his mouth go dry. I didn't." "No, you didn't," Rivera cut in, his voice edged with frustration. "That man right there is General Marcus Reed, a highly decorated officer of the United States Army, a man who has served this country longer than you've worn that badge." Henderson felt his chest tighten. The weight of his mistake was pressing down on him now, heavier with every passing second. Marcus watched him carefully, his expression unreadable. He had dealt with situations like this before, but this one felt different. Maybe it was because of where it happened, in a grocery store, a place where he should have been just another shopper. Maybe it was because of the way Henderson had looked at him, like his presence alone was a threat. Maybe it was because, even after all these years, moments like this still happened. Rivera turned back to Marcus. "Sir, I deeply apologize for what just happened. This is unacceptable." Marcus nodded slightly, but his gaze remained fixed on Henderson. He wasn't interested in an apology from someone else. He wanted to hear it from the man who had judged him without knowing anything about him. Henderson felt that unspoken challenge in the air. He shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of his badge like it was made of stone. He had spent years on the force, convincing himself that he was one of the good ones, that he wasn't like the others, that he was fair. But now, standing here, he couldn't ignore the truth staring him in the face. He hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake." Marcus raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I assumed something about you that wasn't true," Henderson continued, forcing himself to meet Marcus's gaze. "And I acted on it. That was wrong." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Rivera exhaled, looking around at the crowd that was still gathered. "Everyone, please, go about your business. There's nothing more to see here." Slowly, reluctantly, the tension in the store began to ease. People put their phones down, carts started rolling again, whispers faded into the usual background noise. But the weight of what had happened lingered. Marcus finally stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Officer, I don't need an apology. I need you to think about what just happened here. About why it happened. Because this isn't about me. It's about every other person you might have treated the same way, who didn't have a title to make you second-guess yourself." Henderson felt those words hit him harder than anything else. He had spent years believing he was doing the right thing. But had he? How many times had he made assumptions like this? How many times had he let his biases guide his actions? Marcus didn't wait for a response. He turned, picking up his basket again, and continued down the aisle as if nothing had happened. But Henderson knew better. Nothing would ever be the same after this. Rivera and Parker both gave him one last hard look before walking off, leaving him standing there, alone in the middle of the store, surrounded by people who now saw him differently. For the first time in his career, Sergeant Bill Henderson wasn't sure who he really was anymore. Sergeant Bill Henderson stood motionless in the middle of the grocery store, his thoughts racing. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. People were still glancing his way, some shaking their heads, others whispering under their breath. A few shoppers made a deliberate effort to avoid him, steering their carts in the opposite direction. He had never felt so exposed. Rivera and Parker had left him to his own thoughts, making it clear that he was on his own to process this. For the first time in his career, he felt something deeper than embarrassment. It was shame. He had prided himself on being an officer who treated everyone fairly, yet in an instant, his actions had revealed a different truth. He hadn't even realized it until now, but Marcus Reed had. That man, General Reed, had seen right through him. Henderson turned toward the exit, his feet heavy. He needed air. He needed to get out of here. He barely remembered walking to his patrol car, his mind clouded with thoughts that wouldn't quiet down. He got in, shut the door, and sat in silence. His hands were still shaking. He gripped the steering wheel, squeezing it tightly, but it didn't help. The memory of Marcus's calm, unwavering gaze burned in his mind. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was something worse, understanding. His radio crackled, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Henderson, report back to the station. Now." It was Rivera. The tone in his voice made it clear this wasn't a request. Henderson exhaled, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot. His knuckles were still white as he gripped the wheel, but his mind was already somewhere else. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed had left the store, his expression still unreadable. He placed his groceries in the trunk of his car with a controlled precision, but inside, his thoughts were anything but calm. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, but it still hit differently every time. Maybe it was because of how blatant it had been. Maybe it was because he could still hear the way Henderson's voice had sharpened with unearned authority. Maybe it was because he knew, deep down, that there were countless others who had experienced the same thing, without the rank to make people second-guess themselves. Marcus sat in his car for a long moment before pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he landed on a familiar name, Colonel James Holloway. He pressed call. Holloway, came the answer after just one ring. "Jim, it's Marcus." There was a pause, then a knowing sigh. "I saw the video." Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He had suspected people were recording, but hearing confirmation of it made it feel even more real. "Yeah," Marcus said. "That makes two of us. You all right?" Marcus hesitated. "I'm fine." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. "You want me to handle it?" Holloway's voice had that edge to it, the one that meant he was ready to make some calls, pull some strings. "No," Marcus said firmly, "not yet." Holloway was quiet for a moment, then sighed again. "All right, but this isn't going away." Marcus knew that. The moment the video hit social media, it would take on a life of its own. But he wasn't worried about that. He was thinking about something else, about a conversation that needed to happen. "Let me deal with it," Marcus said, "for now." At the police station, Henderson walked in with his shoulders tense. The place felt different, though nothing had changed. Maybe it was just him. Maybe he was finally seeing things from a perspective he had ignored for too long. Rivera was waiting in the captain's office, his arms crossed. The moment Henderson stepped in, the door shut behind him with a sharp click. "Sit." Henderson sat. Rivera didn't speak right away. He just stared at him for a long moment, studying him like he was trying to see something deeper than the uniform. "What happened back there?" Rivera finally asked, his voice calmer than expected. Henderson swallowed. "I made a mistake. That much is obvious." Rivera leaned forward. "I want to know why." Henderson didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but he didn't want to say it out loud, because saying it meant facing it. Rivera exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're lucky that man didn't press charges. You're lucky all he did was walk away." Henderson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "But don't mistake his silence for forgiveness," Rivera continued, "because if you think this is just going to fade away, you're wrong." Henderson's jaw tightened. He knew Rivera was right. Back at Marcus's home, he sat in his office, staring at the video that was now circulating online. It had only been a few hours, but it was already gaining traction. The comments were a mix of outrage, disappointment, and painful familiarity. People were sharing their own experiences. Others were calling for action. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He had spent his life fighting battles overseas, but sometimes the ones at home felt even harder. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Another notification. The world was watching now. And so was Henderson. He sat in his patrol car outside the station, staring at the same video, watching himself make a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. He had thought his years in uniform made him different. He had believed he wasn't part of the problem. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure. Marcus stared at the screen, his fingers tapping against the desk. The video had spread like wildfire. News outlets were picking it up. Comment sections were flooded with heated discussions. Some people were outraged, demanding action, while others tried to justify what had happened. But Marcus wasn't thinking about the internet right now. He was thinking about what needed to be done next. A knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. His wife, Angela, stood there, her expression filled with a quiet concern. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. She knew how much he had been holding in. "You haven't eaten," she said softly. Marcus exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Not hungry." Angela walked in and sat down across from him, her eyes searching his face. "You're thinking about calling him, aren't you?" Marcus hesitated. He had been, but a part of him wasn't sure if it would even make a difference. He had spent his entire career handling conflicts in high-stakes situations, but this was personal. "I just don't know if he's even ready to listen," Marcus admitted. Angela studied him for a moment, then reached out and placed her hand over his. "Then make him ready." The words lingered in the air. At that same moment, Henderson sat in his darkened apartment, the light from his phone screen illuminating his face. He had replayed the video at least a dozen times. Each time, it felt worse. He could hear his own voice, sharp and commanding. He could see the way his hand had moved toward his gun without thinking. But the worst part wasn't the video itself. It was the look in Marcus Reed's eyes. His phone vibrated in his hand, a number he didn't recognize. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but something in his gut told him to answer. He pressed the button and brought the phone to his ear. "Henderson." A pause, then a familiar voice. "Calm, steady. Sergeant Henderson, this is General Reed." Henderson's breath caught in his throat. His grip on the phone tightened. "I think we need to talk." For a second, Henderson didn't know what to say. His mind flashed back to that moment in the grocery store, the way he had assumed, the way he had reacted. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice quieter than he expected. "I think we do." Marcus didn't waste time. "Meet me at the Veterans Memorial downtown. 1 hour. Henderson glanced at the clock. His heart pounded. "I'll be there." When Marcus arrived at the memorial, the air was cool, the streets quieter than usual. He had chosen this spot for a reason. The large stone walls etched with names, the flags swaying gently in the wind. This place held history. It was a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who had served, no matter their background. He didn't have to wait long. Henderson's patrol car pulled up a few minutes later. The officer stepped out, looking hesitant but determined. He approached slowly, his hands in his pockets. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. "You wanted to talk," Henderson finally said. Marcus nodded. "I wanted to look you in the eye when I said this. Do you understand what you did back there?" Henderson swallowed. He had been asking himself that same question over and over again. "I do now," he admitted. "I don't think I fully realized it in the moment, but I do now." Marcus didn't look away. "Tell me what you realized." Henderson exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't see you," he said, his voice raw. I saw you, but I didn't really see you. I saw something else, and I acted on it without even thinking." He paused. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Marcus's expression remained unreadable, but his silence made Henderson keep talking. "I spent years convincing myself that I'm a good cop," Henderson continued. "That I treat everyone fairly, that I don't have bias. But the second I felt a little suspicion, I went straight for my gun. Not because you were a threat, not because you were doing anything wrong, but because I fought I had to be in control." Marcus finally spoke. "You ever think about why that is?" Henderson let out a bitter laugh. "I think about nothing else now." Marcus studied him for a long moment. "I don't need an apology, Sergeant. I need to know that the next time you're in that situation, you don't make the same mistake." Henderson's jaw tightened. "I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be another name people talk about when they say the system is broken." He met Marcus's gaze. "But I know wanting isn't enough." Marcus nodded slowly. "No, it's not." The wind rustled through the memorial, carrying their words into the night. "So what now?" Henderson asked. Marcus looked at him, measuring his next words carefully. "That depends on you." Henderson stood there, the weight of Marcus's words settling in his chest. The night air felt heavier now, the quiet between them stretching longer than before. He knew that whatever he said next mattered. But before he could respond, his radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, we have a disturbance at the downtown precinct. Possible security breach. Backup requested." Henderson instinctively reached for his radio, but his hesitation was clear. He glanced at Marcus, as if silently asking if their conversation was over. Marcus gave a small nod. Go. Henderson pressed the button. Copy that. En route. He turned toward his patrol car, but before he could get in, Marcus spoke again. I'll meet you there. Henderson hesitated. General, Marcus shook his head. You want to change? Then let me show you what's really at stake. Henderson knew better than to argue. Without another word, they both got into their cars and sped toward the station. By the time they arrived, the scene was chaotic. Officers stood outside, hands on their holsters, eyes darting toward the entrance of the building. Henderson immediately recognized the tension in their stance. What's going on? He asked one of the officers on duty. The man shook his head. Some guy stormed in about 10 minutes ago, demanding to speak with the captain. He's locked himself in the holding area. Henderson's gut twisted. Who is he? The officer hesitated. Says he's military. Marcus and Henderson exchanged a glance. Marcus's expression darkened. Without waiting for permission, he pushed past the officers and headed inside. The hallways were eerily silent, save for the occasional radio chatter. The deeper they went, the more the tension grew. And then they saw him. A man stood near the back of the holding cells, pacing. His uniform was wrinkled, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp. Marcus took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. Sergeant Hayes. The man's head snapped up. His hand hovered near his belt. Who the hell are you? Hayes demanded. Marcus didn't flinch. General Reed, you served under me in Kandahar. For a split second, recognition flickered across Hayes's face, but just as quickly it vanished. Henderson took in the scene, the way Hayes's hand twitched, the way his body remained tense, like a coiled spring. This wasn't just some outburst. Something was wrong. Sergeant, Marcus continued, his tone even. You need to tell me what's going on. Hayes's breath came fast. They don't believe me. Believe you about what? Henderson asked, keeping his voice as neutral as possible. Hayes' eyes darted between them. I saw something I wasn't supposed to. Marcus and Henderson exchanged another glance. Talk to us, Marcus urged. Hayes hesitated, then took a deep breath. It's about the captain. He's not who you think he is. The words sent a ripple of unease through the room. Henderson frowned. What are you saying? Hayes looked directly at Marcus. You ever feel like something isn't adding up? Like decisions are being made before the reports are even written? He exhaled sharply. I started paying attention, and what I found, he shook his head. The captain is working with someone outside the force. I don't know who, but I know it's not good. Marcus remained steady, his expression unreadable. You have proof. Hayes' jaw clenched. I did, before they confiscated it. Henderson's pulse quickened. This wasn't the kind of thing you just said out loud without consequences. Marcus nodded. We'll figure this out. But first, we need to get you out of here. Before anyone could move, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. A group of officers appeared, led by none other than Captain Reynolds. His expression was calm, almost too calm. Sergeant Hayes, he said smoothly, I think it's time you came with us. Henderson tensed. Something about the way Reynolds said it felt off. Marcus stepped forward. With all due respect, Captain, I'd like to know what's happening here. Reynolds barely spared him a glance. This is police business, General. I suggest you stay out of it. Marcus didn't move. Neither did Henderson. Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temple as if this was just another inconvenience. Then he signaled to the officers behind him. Take him. The officers moved forward, but before they could reach Hayes, Marcus's voice rang out. Stand down. Everyone froze. Even Reynolds seemed momentarily caught off guard. Marcus stepped in front of Hayes, his presence alone enough to shift the atmosphere in the room. If you're going to arrest him, I want to see the charges. Reynolds's jaw tightened. He's being detained for making threats against the department. Hayes let out a bitter laugh. That's a damn lie. Reynolds's patience was thinning. Step aside, General. Marcus didn't move. Henderson could feel the tension rising to a dangerous level. Then, in one quick motion, Reynolds's hand dropped to his holster. Henderson's breath caught. Not again. For a moment, it felt like time slowed. The room was charged with unspoken decisions, with choices that couldn't be undone. And then Marcus did something no one expected. He took a step closer to Reynolds, his voice low but powerful. "I've spent my entire life serving this country," Marcus said, "and I know a cover-up when I see one." Reynolds's fingers twitched against his holster, but Marcus wasn't finished. "You want to take him in," he continued. "Then let's do it by the book. I want a full report. I want a lawyer present. And I want this department to explain why a decorated soldier is suddenly a threat." Reynolds's eyes narrowed. "You don't give orders here." Marcus tilted his head. "No, but I do ask questions. And right now, everyone in this room is wondering the same thing." A heavy silence settled over the room. Henderson could feel a shift, the uncertainty creeping into the other officers' faces. Reynolds must have noticed it too, because his expression hardened. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The tension remained long after he was gone. Henderson exhaled slowly. "This isn't over." Marcus nodded, "Not even close." Henderson stood in the dimly lit hallway, the tension from what had just unfolded still thick in the air. Marcus remained calm, but there was a sharpness in his eyes. He wasn't done. Sergeant Hayes exhaled shakily, looking between them. "You know he's going to come back, right?" Marcus nodded. "That's why we need to move now." Henderson hesitated, his mind racing. This wasn't just about one bad cop anymore. If what Hayes was saying was true, this went much deeper. And if Reynolds had been this bold already, there was no telling what he might do next. They needed proof. Henderson knew the station had a backup server where old security footage was stored before being deleted. If there was anything connecting Reynolds to the corruption Hayes mentioned, it would be there. The problem: that room was locked down tight, and only a handful of people had access, including Reynolds himself. Marcus seemed to already be thinking ahead. "Where's the security office?" Henderson took a breath. "Down the hall, last door on the right." Marcus nodded. "Then let's move." They moved quickly but carefully, staying just out of sight. The station wasn't fully staffed this late, but that didn't mean they were alone. Any wrong move, and they'd be caught before they got what they needed. When they reached the security room, Henderson tried the door. Locked. Of course. Hayes muttered under his breath. "We're wasting time." Marcus reached into his pocket, pulled out a thin metal tool, and slid it into the lock. Within seconds, there was a faint asterisk click asterisk, and the door creaked open. Henderson stared. "Where did you learn that?" Marcus gave him a small smirk. "I spent years overseas. You learn a few things." They slipped inside and shut the door behind them. The room was dark except for the glow of multiple screens displaying security feeds. Henderson moved to the main console, typing quickly. "If there's anything here, it'll be in the archives," he muttered. Marcus and Hayes stood behind him, watching as files scrolled across the screen. Then suddenly, there. A video file from 2 weeks ago, late at night after most of the department had cleared out. The footage showed Captain Reynolds in the interrogation room, speaking with a man in civilian clothes. At first, there was no audio, but then the recording picked up static before clearing. Henderson turned up the volume. "Handled, just like the others." The voice was Reynolds's. The other man leaned forward. "You're sure? No loose ends?" Reynolds smirked. "Come on, you know me." The video continued, and as it did, the truth became painfully clear. They weren't just talking about covering up minor infractions. This was organized, deliberate. Evidence tampered with, reports rewritten, people threatened into silence. And then, I don't like that soldier sniffing around, the other man said. Reynolds exhaled. He won't be a problem much longer. The video cut out. Silence filled the room. Henderson felt a chill run through him. This wasn't just misconduct. This was a conspiracy. Marcus clenched his jaw. We need to get this out. Now. But before they could move, the sound of heavy footsteps filled the hallway. Henderson barely had time to shut the computer before the door burst open. Reynolds stood there, gun drawn, flanked by 2 officers. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? He said. Marcus took a slow step forward, keeping his hands where they could be seen. It's over, Reynolds. We have everything we need. Reynolds tilted his head. You think that matters? He scoffed. You don't get it, do you? This whole place runs on power, and right now, I have all of it. Henderson's hand inched toward his radio. If that were true, you wouldn't be here pointing a gun at us. For the first time, Reynolds hesitated, and in that moment, Marcus moved. With the precision of a trained soldier, he lunged forward, knocking Reynolds' gun aside. The weapon discharged, the sound deafening in the small room. Henderson and Hayes sprang into action, wrestling the other officers to the ground. The fight was short but brutal. When it was over, Reynolds was pinned beneath Marcus, his own cuffs locking around his wrists, his face twisted with rage. This isn't over, he spat. Marcus leaned down, his voice cold. Oh, it is, and you're going to pay for every single thing you've done. Within minutes, backup arrived. Officers who had once been under Reynolds' command now stood on the other side, watching as he was dragged away in cuffs. The weight of his downfall settled over the station like a long overdue storm. Henderson exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Did that just happen? Hayes let out a shaky laugh. Yeah, it did. Marcus looked at Henderson. What happens next is up to you. Henderson knew what he meant. Change wouldn't come overnight, but tonight had proved something important. It proved that standing up was worth it. He nodded. Then let's get to work. As they stepped out into the cool night air, a sense of something new filled the air. Justice wasn't always easy, but tonight it had won. The night air felt different as Marcus, Henderson, and Hayes stepped outside the station. The weight of everything that had just happened settled over them, heavy but not unbearable. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the right people had won. But even as Reynolds was taken away, his bitter words still echoed in Henderson's mind. This isn't over, Marcus exhaled, his gaze steady as he looked at Henderson. You know he's not wrong. Henderson nodded, already feeling the reality of what was ahead. Yeah, but it's a start. The corruption within the department wouldn't disappear overnight. Henderson knew that. There were still officers who had turned a blind eye, people who had looked the other way because it was easier. Some out of fear, some out of loyalty to men like Reynolds. But the difference now was that the truth was out. The proof was undeniable. And with Reynolds gone, the hold he had over the department was already breaking apart. Hayes let out a slow breath, his hands resting on his hips. I don't know what comes next for me, he admitted. I enlisted to serve, not to be treated like a threat in my own country. Marcus nodded in understanding. You served your country. And tonight, you served justice. Hayes shook his head, his expression tired but thoughtful. I just did what was right. Henderson looked at him, then at Marcus. He thought about the choices he had made that night, about how close he had come to being another officer who let things slide. He had grown up believing in the law, in the system, but now he saw how easily those things could be twisted. He had been given a choice, to protect the lie or to stand for something real. He had chosen the latter. The sound of sirens faded into the distance as Reynolds was taken away. More officers had started to gather, murmuring among themselves, some looking relieved, others uncertain. Henderson knew the department would be shaken by this. Some would resist the change, but others would realize it was necessary. One of the younger officers, a man named Lewis, stepped forward. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Reynolds was working with someone outside the department. Henderson met his gaze. "We have proof, and there's going to be a full investigation." Lewis swallowed hard but nodded. "What happens now?" Marcus glanced at Henderson, but it was Henderson who answered. "We rebuild. We do it right this time." It wasn't going to be easy. There would be backlash, resistance from those who had benefited from the old ways. But Henderson wasn't afraid of that anymore. He had seen firsthand what happened when power went unchecked. He wasn't going to let that happen again. Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Then you'd better get started." Henderson looked at him, realizing this was where their paths diverged. Marcus had been the catalyst for everything that had happened tonight, but this wasn't his fight to finish. It was Henderson's. It was every officer's who had sworn to serve and protect. "You leaving?" Henderson asked. Marcus gave a small smile. "I think my part here is done." Hayes looked at him. "And where are you headed?" Marcus exhaled, looking out at the city. "Wherever I'm needed next." There was something about the way he said it that made it clear. This wasn't the first time he had stepped in to set things right, and it wouldn't be the last. Henderson extended a hand. "Thank you for everything." Marcus shook it firmly. "Make it count." With that, Marcus turned and walked toward his car, disappearing into the night like a man who had done this before, like a man who understood that justice wasn't just about one night. It was about the fight that never really ended. Hayes watched him go, then looked back at Henderson. "You really think this place can change?" Henderson nodded, but there was no illusion in his eyes. "It has to." Inside the station, the gears of change were already turning. Officers whispered, paperwork was filed, and for the first time in a long time, the weight of silence had been broken. The city would wake up to the news. Headlines would spread, reports would be written. Some people would be shocked, others wouldn't. But one thing was certain, this wasn't something that could be buried. Henderson took a deep breath, looking up at the sky. It was still dark, but somewhere in the distance, the first traces of dawn were beginning to break through. A new day was coming, and this time, it felt different.